diplomatic pace is accelerating.
There have been follow-on visits and meetings involving the CIA and other U.S. and North Korean officials.
The real question in my mind is whether or not President Trump, whether he will water it down in pursuit of a deal.
The key issues are speed and scope, the nuclear dismantlement.
Kim Jong-un's engagement with President Xi and with Moon Jae-in, both of which appeared optically to be positive but inconclusive in terms of determining.
I mean, why would Kim Jong-un spend all this money and time and effort and endure all this pain to build a nuclear program simply then to trade it away?
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The diplomatic pace is accelerating as President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un prepare for their summit. We'll look at the latest U.S. strategy for talks with North Korea. Also, how are regional stakeholders like China and Japan moving to ensure that they are also part of the process?
We are committed to the permanent, verifiable, irreversible dismantling of North Korea's weapons of mass destruction program.
Now my guest today, Mr. James Schoff, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Schoff was a Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy to the Secretary of Defense. Also joining us today, Mr. Ryan Haas, Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Haas was the Director for China at the National Security Council from 2013 to 2017 and served as U.S. diplomat for 15 years, mostly in Asia. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, President Trump expedited the timetable for the summit with Kim Jong-un, and Secretary Pompeo said there's a real opportunity here. Is the Washington receiving positive signals from Pyongyang?
Washington is getting positive signals from Kim Jong-un and getting them directly. We had the dramatic trip by Pompeo to Pyongyang where he spoke directly with Kim Jong-un. There have been follow-on visits and meetings involving the CIA and other U.S. and North Korean officials. And North Korea is being very forthcoming. I think to some extent they're being coached by the South Koreans in terms of understanding what the Americans want to hear. And we have a lot of momentum going into this proposed meeting.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, Secretary Pompeo this week said several times that the U.S. is committed to permanent, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's WMD. He also said that when he met with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, they discussed a great deal about how civic process may look like. So is Secretary Pompeo showing a strong resolve to North Korea before the discussions start?
Possibly, Eun-jung, but I think what he's doing is reaffirming what has been a long-standing United States position. The United States, for a long period of time, has been pursuing the complete, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. He's simply reiterating what has been the policy for quite some time. Mm-hmm. The real question in my mind is whether or not President Trump will adhere to that long-standing policy or whether he will water it down in pursuit of a deal.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned that President Trump may water it down, but and the Trump administration also says that it will not repeat past mistakes. Considering the current circumstances, could it be different this time?
Well, I think we all hope so, but it's really too early to tell. President Trump has shown himself to be a showman. Everyone knows that he's capable of putting on a grand show. The question now is whether he's also capable of becoming a statesman. Mm-hmm. To be a statesman, you need to make calculated decisions about costs and benefits and trade-offs. No one gets everything that they want mm-hmm. in any negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Jim, what are your thoughts? Could it be different this time?
Well, I think the key issues are speed and scope of the nuclear dismantlement. Those have been the two roadblocks that we've always run into. Mm-hmm. And John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, was the one before, during the George W. Bush administration, that essentially kind of scuttled the agreed framework that we had going at the time because he thought the scope was not broad enough and there was hidden uranium enrichment activities going on in North Korea. So these early signals we're getting suggest that North Korea is saying what the Americans want to hear, that okay, speed is okay, some relatively short timeline, 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years, something so that Americans can get a feel early how sincere North Korea is about denuclearization.
I think Jim raises an excellent point. If you look only at the historical record, I think there's a lot of reason for pessimism and skepticism about whether North Korea will abide by any commitment that it reaches, because the record to date has been so troubling. The question is, why has the Trump administration been so determined to raise expectations rather than manage them? And we're going to have to wait to find out about that.
Maybe they have some kind of convictions coming from North Korea, prior promises from North Korea. Is that maybe why they raised their expectations?
It's the best explanation I think anyone can come up with. At the moment, I don't think we have a lot of visibility into what Kim Jong-un has been telling Secretary Pompeo and others. What we have is the past historic record of North Korea's negotiating record, and Kim Jong-un's engagement with President Xi and with Moon Jae-in, both of which appeared optically to be positive, but inconclusive in terms of determining the scope and speed at which North Korea may be willing to denuclearize.
Plus, there's the illogic of it all, in a sense. I mean, why would Kim Jong-un spend all this money and time and effort and endure all this pain to build a nuclear program simply then to trade it away? And, he could have had this kind of a negotiation with the Americans 5 years ago. And so why now? But our suspicion still is that the country is going to want to hold on to some kind of nuclear capability to ensure, guarantee its survival, and that's going to be a deal breaker, we would think. And then that's the question mark about Trump. Would he kind of say, well, okay, a little bit of nuclear weapons is okay? Right.
Well, questions remain until the big meeting, and in that big meeting, what would President Trump and President Kim Jong-un, what kind of outlines would they draw, Ryan?
Well, it's a great question. Typically, in a summit meeting like this, there is an intensive series of preparatory meetings to try to shrink the space of uncertainty so that there is no question mark or confusion when both leaders walk in the room, that it's pretty clearly established. For example, when President Obama traveled to Beijing in 2014, what was left to negotiate was 2 words. Everything else had been settled. President Trump is a very unconventional leader who's pursuing an unconventional approach to this. I think that he wants to maximize his negotiating space rather than confine it by pre-agreeing to a series of steps.
Jim, there's a report that President Trump asked the Pentagon to consider reducing the size of U.S. troops from South Korea, and in response, National Security Advisor John Bolton said the New York Times story is utter nonsense. The president has not asked the Pentagon to provide options for reducing American forces stationed in South Korea. Now, veracity aside, it does raise question. So what would be the reasons that Trump administration may consider reducing the size of U.S. troops from South Korea?
Well, this gets to the broad outline question that you asked, in terms of, certainly the Americans are focused on denuclearization, verification regime, and all those issues. The trade, what we presume Kim Jong-un is looking for, is security assurances and some kind of peace that he can believe in. So the question is, what does that look like? Is a piece of paper signed by President Trump, I won't invade you, enough? Probably not. It will relate to behavior, to the frequency of exercises or the scale of military exercises. But it could also eventually get into the number of U.S. forces in Korea, or the arrangement between South Korea and the United States in terms of how their alliance works.
Can I just offer one thought on this to complement what Jim is saying? He's making an excellent point. Setting aside whether or not President Trump has or has not ordered the Pentagon to schedule troop reductions, this is part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. This is a firmly held conviction that President Trump has had for some time. During the campaign, he talked about why is the United States subsidizing other countries' defenses, especially developed countries such as South Korea's. This idea that once strategic objectives are met, the United States should be able to reduce forces abroad and return troops and reduce the expenditures for keeping troops abroad. And I worry that it will send 2 very dangerous signals. The first is to Kim Jong-un. This idea that President Trump is so eager to claim success, to proclaim peace, that he will consider the idea of reducing or withdrawing U.S. troops. I think that that will weaken rather than strengthen President Trump's leverage going into any talks with Kim Jong-un. But at a broader level, my concern is that it will harden views in Asia about the United States abdicating its leadership role that it's held for the past 70 years. And if that's the case, if the United States no longer serves as a buffer to prevent countries from clashing with each other, then I think that we could find ourselves in a very dangerous dynamic where countries face a choice between either becoming deferential to China or acquiring or developing military capabilities to resist Chinese coercion. And if that happens, and if countries move in the direction of going nuclear, we could find ourselves in a very dangerous dilemma in Asia.
I do want to touch upon the regional stakeholders before we move on. Jim, in a couple of days, there will be leaders of the South Korea and Japan will meet, and China will also join. They all have different interests. So how can this meeting be helpful to the upcoming U.S. and North Korea summit?
Well, it's a long-standing effort to try to reconvene this trilateral meeting. So just having it is positive in terms of regional cooperation, communication. It'll be the first time, I think, that South Korean president has been to Japan in almost 6 years or so. So there's a couple of milestones just in that. Abe is at a disadvantage a little bit because the Japanese Prime Minister has not met with Kim Jong-un other than the leaders of South Korea and China recently. So I think he wants to be reassured that they're still roughly on the same page, that the Chinese and the South Koreans are not going to try to convince Abe that we need to give all kinds of economic incentives to North Korea early on. He wants to maintain this idea of holding off on sanctions relief until we get concrete movement on denuclearization. But any kind of solidarity I think they can come to in support of what's going on the peninsula should strengthen the foundation a little bit or for a U.S.-North Korean meeting.
Before I go, just briefly, I do want to touch upon China. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited North Korea recently. What is China's agenda to North Korea?
It's a great question. It has been interesting to watch China's behavior following President Trump's announcement that he was willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. They have decided to bracket President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un with a visit by Kim Jong-un to Beijing beforehand and a planned visit by Xi Jinping to Pyongyang afterwards. And Wang Yi has obviously been going in the intervening period. The Chinese clearly want to protect their interests on the Korean Peninsula. They feel like they are an essential piece of the puzzle, and they don't want to allow themselves to be sidelined. What do they want to achieve? I think that they would welcome any outcome that reduces the likelihood of conflict, and they also would welcome any outcome that reduces the footprint or presence of U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment.
That's very nice, thank you.
I thought it was very generous of President Moon of South Korea to make that statement, and I appreciate it, but the main thing is to get it done.
Republican congressmen sent a letter to the Norwegian Nobel Committee nominating President Trump for the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. South Korean President Moon Jae-in also said President Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize. Ryan, we're still so early in negotiations with North Korea. Why are we hearing about these talks of President Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon to watch, Yoon-jung. I think that there are a variety of factors at play. On one hand, it's an open secret that President Trump responds well to flattery. and that it's a pathway to influencing his behavior. On another hand, I think there are people who want to try to lock President Trump into a diplomatic process and see this as a useful way of doing so, dangling the idea of a Nobel Prize out on the horizon to keep him moving in that direction. And then domestically within the United States, I think there are some people who recognize that President Trump is facing some headwinds politically and see talk of a Nobel Peace Prize as a way of propping up and boosting his standing at home.
Jim, if we get a peace accord on paper, is it worthy of a Nobel Prize, and who is the most worthy?
Well, certainly if we end the Korean War and have a real honest-to-goodness peace treaty between North Korea and South Korea, the United States, in this, that is deserving, I think, of a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, who would deserve credit for that? Right now, my support would go for President Moon because of his, I think he's the force behind this whole process. It's nice that he defers to President Trump and plays to his ego, and I think he's sincere when he says, I just care about peace. I don't necessarily need this hardware. But the other, it would be interesting to consider whether Kim Jong-un would be, it would be kind of received or given to both of them, because it would not be possible without a fundamental change of decision, I think, by North Korea, by Kim Jong-un. So as long as we keep our principles, I mean, my big worry is that we trade away some level of quality verification or ignoring human rights and other issues that are really important.
Jim, President Kim Dae-jung, because you mentioned Moon and Kim Jong-un, President Kim Dae-jung of South Korea also won the Nobel Peace Prize for meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, but even after his awarding that prize, North Korea continued its nuclear development, and President Kim was criticized for sustaining North Korea economically. So what is the takeaway from here?
The takeaway is don't give a peace prize too early. And I think, you know, that's, in this particular case, we won't see a Nobel unless there's real peace achieved and denuclearization is well underway. And, you know, that was part of the criticism with the Nobel Award to President Obama, that it was more aspirational, trying to start something momentous, and I give him credit for that. But now it's harder to kind of keep doing that if you're always getting back to that first step again.
Ryan, is President Obama receiving the prize in 2009, and the current situation, is it similar or different?
Well, one president did receive it and one aspires to, so it's different in the most basic level. But I think to your question, both of these would be aspirational awards of a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think that between now and the time of the next Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony that all nuclear weapons will be removed from the Korean Peninsula and peace will be upon us. I think that we will still face a formidable challenge on the Korean Peninsula. And so it'll be a question of whether pledges on paper that may or may not have verification behind them in the best case scenario, are good enough to qualify someone for that type of recognition.
Well, we'll end this discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a cartoon on the New York Times. The New York Times asks, how is Kim Jong-un preparing for his meeting with Donald Trump? We can see Kim Jong-un on his bed with hamburgers and reading President Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. Now, Jim, what is your reaction?
My reaction is that it looks like Trump is being, you know, taken advantage of in this situation. So if this is the scenario, we're in trouble. If it's really about Kim kind of figuring out how do I out Trump, so we can only hope that he's spending more time thinking about a future North Korea that is more open internationally and open economically and not relying on nuclear weapons. This picture suggests otherwise.
Ryan?
Well, I applaud his appreciation of hamburgers in this picture as a fan of hamburgers myself, but my guess is that Kim Jong-un is spending more time studying the playbook that his dad and his grandfather gave him than the one that President Trump is attributed to.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ryan, Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.